Hey everyone. Next speaker is Roshni Lulla. Roshni is a PhD student in the brain and cognitive sciences at USC, investigating emotion and decision-making in the brain. She is also co-founder and COO of Recordless, an interactive music streaming platform giving more power to artists. She is a graduate of NYU in neural sciences with experience in a variety of research fields, including clinical, computational, and lab-based research. Please welcome Roshni Lulla.
Is anyone a fan of Marvel? Does anyone watch Marvel movies? A couple people? Yeah, so if you watch the Avengers, it's loosely a group of superheroes that protect the world and fight off the bad guys. And there's this movie called The Age of Ultron. It's basically this robot that's created by one of the Avengers, and his goal is to keep the peace. So he's created with the idea of peace in our time. So he scans through, when he wakes up, he scans through all the disasters that have happened in the world, and basically decides that humans and the Avengers are the world's greatest enemy, and wages this big war on the world. And when we think of what the goal of AI should be, it should really be to have optimal solutions while keeping in mind human welfare and trying to avoid harm as much as possible. So when you think of what Ultron's goal was at the end of that movie, it's not really avoiding harm that much. So today we're going to be talking about empathy and AI. My name is Roshni Lulla, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the Brain and Creativity Institute, and we'll be talking about some concepts that our lab studies. This includes morality, so we'll talk about the moral foundations a bit, what empathy really is, so we'll dive into the neural basis of empathy, so what we see in the brain when people experience empathy, and then what artificial empathy stands as today. So starting with the moral foundations, so this is a theory that was created with a couple different professors, including a professor here at USC, Professor Morteza Degani. He's also associated with the BCI. And then also based off of the theories of a professor at NYU, Jonathan Haidt, who works across psychology and economics. And it basically breaks down morality into these 5 basic foundations. 2 of them are individualizing, which means they are associated more with liberalism, and those are care and fairness. And then 3 of them are binding, which is associated a little bit more with conservatism. And that's loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So in relation to empathy today, we're going to be focusing on the care and harm foundation. This is our ability to feel and specifically dislike the pain of others. So that's seeing someone else that's in harm, and then recognizing they're in harm and disliking that. And this is really what's essential for harm aversion, because you're seeing someone else in pain, you're disliking their pain, and you want to avoid that pain as much as possible. When we talk about what empathy is today, if you look it up on Google, it says it's the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. Let's really break this down. So in psychology, when we study empathy, our lab specifically uses the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, and it's basically a scale that's used to measure and understand individual differences in empathy. And what this scale does, it breaks down empathy into these 4 subcategories, and that's perspective taking, fantasy, empathetic concern, and personal distress. When we talk about what empathy is in the brain, we really wrap it up into these 2 subcategories, which are cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And in relation to the IRI that we just saw, cognitive empathy is associated with perspective taking and fantasy, and then affective empathy is associated with empathetic concern and personal distress. So let's talk about cognitive empathy first. This is the ability to infer and model the states of others. So this is seeing someone else in some type of situation and trying to predict what they would feel based on the situation that they're in, and then based on how they would feel, predict how they would react. So this is what we see being built into AI today. And when we talk about the brain, this is associated with higher functional connectivity in what we call the default mode network. And when I say functional connectivity, that means these brain regions are activating at the same time together, so they're functionally connected to each other. And the default mode network is associated with a lot of different things, including executive functioning. In relation to empathy, this is related to interoceptive awareness, which is our ability to understand and react to our internal state. So figure out how our body is feeling and then use that in our behavior. So that's what's associated higher with cognitive empathy. When we talk about affective empathy, This allows us to really share in the feelings of others. So when we go back to the moral foundations theory, this relates back to that care-harm foundation, where you're feeling and specifically disliking the pain of others, and this relates to all different types of states. And this is really essential for harm aversion. So again, with that care-harm foundation, you're feeling someone else's pain and then wanting to avoid that pain or that harm as much as possible. So as I said before, affective empathy is associated with empathetic concern and personal distress on the IRI scale, and that really motivates pro-social behavior because you're feeling personally distressed from someone else's pain or someone else's harm, and so you want to do something to get them out of that. So you'll do something pro-social to get them out of that state. So this is kind of what we're seeing that's lacking from AI today. So what is AI today? So artificial empathy, if you look into how they're developing that now, this is the idea of predicting someone else's internal state based on their surroundings and their conditions, and then predicting their reaction to that. So again, going back to that breakdown of cognitive versus affective empathy, this is really hitting on the cognitive empathy side of things. You are inferring someone else's internal state, predicting what their reaction would be, and then going off of that. This is kind of forgetting about the idea of internalizing someone else's pain and feeling that personal distress. So how do we fix this? So our lab studies empathy and decision-making and things like that. So one of the proposed solutions that our lab has come up with is creating an embodied AI. So I work with Professor Antonio Damasio and Jonas Kaplan at the Brain Creativity Institute, and Professor Damasio has this idea of homeostatic feelings. So if any of you have taken biology, there's this idea of homeostasis, which is our body's natural equilibrium. And this includes like the temperature that we like to be at, our natural hormone balance, and this can be shifted as simply as being hungry. And then you feel something about that, some people feel hangry, and then you go and do something to get yourself back to homeostasis. So if we were able to add this homeostatic need into AI, this would allow AI to acknowledge a risk to self. So they have a natural homeostasis, something causes an imbalance in that homeostasis, and they understand that there's some type of risk or benefit to themselves. And this is, again, bringing back that idea of affective empathy and adding that into AI. This is something that could maybe make our boy Ultron a little bit happier. And so our lab has released a bunch of papers on this and talking about the idea of creating a well-behaved robot or a feeling machine. And this is, again, bringing in that idea of affective empathy. So it's the idea of motivating this pro-social behavior because you're feeling some type of personal distress through this affective empathy. So again, the idea is harm that you see brought onto others is equivalent to harm to yourself, and benefit to others feels like benefit to the self. So again, bringing that affective empathy into AI. So our lab has released a couple papers on this. There is a paper that really talks about how to avoid what we call robotic sociopaths and use neuroscience based on how humans develop and use empathy in their behavior. And then there's another paper that, again, talks about that homeostasis and creating an embodied AI to create these feeling machines. Thank you.